Soviet Marshal Rodion Malinovsky. In April 1944, when Red Army tanks were smashing through smoke-filled streets into the heart of Odessa, a staff car suddenly threaded its way to the head of the advancing Russian columns. In it sat General Rodion Malinovsky, commander of the armies that had already swept the German invaders back 600 miles across southern Russia from the banks of the Volga at Stalingrad. Malinovsky was coming home, back to the big Black Sea port where he had emerged from the slums as a ragged beggar boy to become one of the greatest Russian military heroes of World War II. As the red flags were hoisted over Odessa's ruined buildings, thousands of partisans, bursting from cellars and sewers to fight in the streets alongside the soldiers, crowded in jubilation round the general's staff car. Ever afterwards, Malinovsky insisted that this was the greatest moment of his career, greater even than his shattering triumph at Stalingrad and his desperate battles to reconquer the vital industries of the Don Valley. A slow, stubborn, unreasoning, old-fashioned Bolshevik was how an American diplomat once described the burly, hard-drinking and rough-tongued Rodion Malinovsky. The Red Army called him the friend of the lower ranks, for even as a much-decorated marshal and eventually Russian defense minister, he never forgot his own humble origins in the gutters of pre-revolution Odessa. Less brilliant and ambitious than many of his high-ranking colleagues, he survived all the bloody purges of the Stalinist era. "I have only one loyalty," he once said bluntly, "and that is to the soldiers of the Red Army." Born in the poorest quarter of Odessa in 1898, Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky began his career as a conscript in the Tsarist army of World War I. He was a corporal when his regiment mutinied and marched back from the front during the 1917 revolution. Young Malinovsky then immediately joined one of the Red Army units fighting in Siberia. A dedicated Bolshevik, tough, obedient and noted for his tremendous physical strength, he had reached the rank of captain by the time the civil wars ended in the triumph of the communist regime. Determined to make the army his career, he studied at Soviet military academies and earned a reputation as a solid, dependable, but strictly orthodox officer. In the nightmare days of the 1930s, when Stalin's purges cut a swathe of death through the highest ranks of the Red Army, no one paid any attention to the unassuming and hard-working Major General Malinovsky at his obscure staff post in Leningrad. He took little part in the first desperate months after the Nazi blitzkrieg. After the Nazis invaded Russia in 1941. But as Hitler's mechanized hordes slashed ever deeper into Russian soil, he was one of the new commanders hurried to the southern front to check the enemy's devastating sweep across the Caucasus. It was in the murderous fighting during the long, bitter retreat from the Dnieper to the Don and finally to the Volga that Malinovsky earned his fame as one of the greatest defensive strategists in the Red Army. However, within a year Russia had lost a huge slice of her industrial potential. Whole armies had been encircled and obliterated in the Nazi torrent, and the entire southern front seemed in danger of collapse. In Stalin's ruthless reshuffle of commands, Malinovsky emerged in supreme control of the extreme south, and from then, in mid-1942, the tide slowly began to turn. The supreme crisis came at Stalingrad, where, by September 1942, von Paulus's German army had completely surrounded the huge industrial city and was steadily pounding it into a vast desert of death and destruction. Week after week, Hitler screamed hysterically that Stalingrad must be taken. Week after week, the heroic defenders hurled back every German attempt to crash into the ruins. Then, as the snow and ice of freezing winter added to the hell of the battle, von Paulus's decimated army in turn found itself surrounded by the advancing Russians. Generals Malinovsky, Rokossovsky, Konev and Tolbukin, the four horsemen of the German apocalypse, closed in on Stalingrad and sealed a ring of death round the doomed besiegers. It was Malinovsky who wrote Finis, to the fearful struggle when the Germans made their last frantic effort to break out of the trap in December 1942, only to be hurled back into the inferno they had created. A month later, von Paulus surrendered. More than 200,000 of his men were dead, 90,000 were prisoners, and Hitler's hopes of conquering Russia had been buried forever in the blood-stained snows of Stalingrad. Decorations and promotion rained on Malinovsky. He was awarded the Order of Suvorov, Russia's highest military honour. He became a full general, and a 300-gun salute was fired as a tribute to him in Moscow's Red Square. But his hardest tasks still lay ahead. 18 months of ceaseless, savage and costly fighting as he struggled to roll the Germans back from their enormous conquests in southern Russia. Despite the debacle of Stalingrad, Hitler was still fanatically determined to cling to the great industrial centres in the Don and Donets valleys and the rich agricultural lands of the Ukraine. Their recapture was also vital to Russia, but every mile had to be won at the price of terrible battles, the kind of slogging infantry and artillery battles in which the Orthodox General Malinovsky excelled. It cost Malinovsky 3 months and more than 150,000 casualties to drive into Kharkov, the key city on the Donets, and 5 German divisions and hundreds of tanks and aircraft were obliterated in the final onslaught. Even then, some of the bloodiest fighting of World War II remained ahead as Malinovsky, reinforced by fresh armies, ground his way remorselessly on towards the Dnieper. One after another the big towns, with their ruined factories, power plants and colossal dams, which had been once the pride of Stalin's 5-year plans, were retaken, while losses on both sides soared towards 500,000 men. A fierce German stand around Zaporozhye was broken up when Malinovsky used newly arrived tank units to slash gaps in the enemy front and then wreak havoc amongst petroleum and supply dumps in the rear. At Melitopol, the Germans had ringed the city with a vast system of trenches, tank ditches and gun emplacements in response to another stand-or-die order from Hitler. For a week, Malinovsky battered vainly with tanks and aircraft. Then he hurled in waves of infantry, and Melitopol was finally taken by what were probably the last massed bayonet charges in the history of warfare. More than 100,000 Germans were captured at Melitopol, and still, regardless of his losses in men, tanks and guns, Malinovsky kept up his relentless pressure on the retreating foe. On October 23, 1943, with freak snowstorms and torrential icy rains flooding the rivers and plains, the advance units of Malinovsky's army crossed the Dnieper and began their final drive toward the Russian frontier. Nikopol, which had supplied 60% of the manganese for the Nazi war machine, was stormed early in February 1944. The steel town of Krivoy Rog fell a fortnight later. By the end of March, Malinovsky was driving on towards Odessa, the target that had haunted him ever since he had begun his long march from the Volga more than a year before. Odessa, scene of the historical naval mutiny in 1907, was one of the cradles of the Communist Revolution. Throughout the Nazi occupation, it had been racked by partisan uprisings, all of them pitilessly and bloodily subdued. Now, as the Red Army drew near, the partisans struck again, 10,000 of them streaming from factories, dockyards and underground hideouts to harry the German defenders with gunfire, dynamite and Molotov cocktails. Day by day the battle edged through the rubble-strewn streets. Then on April 10th, with Malinovsky's bullet-scarred staff car in the lead, the Red Army tanks crashed into the heart of the city. The capture of Odessa was the last full-scale battle Malinovsky's veterans had to endure. They had reached the Russian frontier. Ahead lay invasion of the crumbling citadel of Nazi-occupied Europe. In August 1944, Malinovsky stormed into Romania, captured the Ploesti oil fields, entered Bucharest against only feeble opposition, and signed a peace treaty with the new Romanian government. A month later, now a marshal of the Soviet Union, he led his army across the Hungarian border and joined with Marshal Tolbuchen in a lightning swoop against Budapest. By the time the war ended with the death of Hitler in the burning shambles of Berlin, he was inside Czechoslovakia, more than 1,000 miles from the starting point on the banks of the river Volga. One of the longest and mightiest offensives in military history was over, but Malinovsky's reputation was too high for him to be left with an army of occupation in Eastern Europe. As soon as the German surrender was complete, he was transferred to take command of the army massing in Siberia to lunge into Japanese-held Mongolia. Then the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima made the campaign unnecessary. However, because of the tension with America after Japan's collapse and the outbreak of the Korean War, more than 10 years passed before Malinovsky was brought back to Moscow. Then, in October 1957, when Khrushchev sacked Marshal Zhukov from his post of Soviet Defense Minister, it was necessary to find a safe and loyal successor to the overpowerful Zhukov. Malinovsky was the obvious choice. He had never tried to meddle in politics. He was a devoted and unquestioning communist, and he was the hero of the rank and file of the Red Army. Thus, Marshal Malinovsky became Defense Minister, and he held the post throughout the upheaval of Khrushchev's fall. Malinovsky died on March 31, 1967.